Welcome to Lore of the Ring, where we uncover the hidden roads of Middle-earth and tell the tales that Tolkien never wrote. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. The wind moves strangely through the eaves of Roscoble, not the clean, wild breath of autumn that carries the scent of rain and turning leaves. No. This wind is different. It crawls along the forest floor like something wounded, trembling through the undergrowth with a rhythm that does not belong to nature. The birds sense it first. A lone thrush beats its wings against the oncoming dusk, frantic, desperate, as though fleeing an invisible predator. Its cry is sharp and broken, a sound that pierces the twilight like a needle through silk. Radagast the Brown stands alone on the threshold of his dwelling, a structure more root than timber, more living than built. His staff rests lightly in his gnarled hand, but his eyes are closed. He is not watching. He is listening. Not with ears, though his hearing is keen beyond mortal measure. He listens with something older, something woven into the fabric of his being long before he took the shape of an old man in a threadbare robe. He listens with the ancient awareness of a Maya, a spirit who walked in the timeless halls before the world was sung into existence. And what he hears makes his breath catch. There is a tremor in the living world, not of earth, not of storm, a tremor of spirit. The weave of nature itself shivers, like the surface of still water disturbed by something rising from beneath. Radagast opens his eyes, and they are dark with knowledge that no other living soul in Middle-earth possesses at this moment. The animals know. The trees know. The very soil beneath his feet knows. Something is waking. Something that should have remained buried, forgotten, dissolved into the long silence of ages past. Around him, the forest recoils. Deer that once grazed fearlessly near his home now flee southward in sudden, panicked herds. Foxes abandon their dens in the dead of night, leaving behind cubs too young to travel. Wolves howl from distant ridges, their voices edged not with hunger but with terror. Even the spiders, those patient weavers of shadow and silk, scatter from their ancient haunts as if driven by an unseen flame. The roots of the great oaks twist and writhe in the soil, their slow voices murmuring words Radagast has not heard since the elder days, words of warning, of grief, of something unnatural pressing against the boundaries of the world. He steps forward, placing his palm against the bark of the nearest tree. Its heartwood pulses weakly beneath his touch, sick with a poison that has no name. The leaves above him tremble though the air is still. They are dying. Not from drought, not from blight, but from something deeper, something that reaches into the essence of life itself and whispers, fade, wither, fall. Radagast has walked Middle-earth for more than 2,000 years. He has seen the rise and fall of kingdoms, the slow retreat of the elves, the spreading shadow of Dol Guldur. But this is different. This is older. This is not the work of Sauron alone, no matter how mighty the Dark Lord has become. This corruption moves like a sickness through the veins of the world, as though the land itself has been wounded, as though some ancient venom, long dormant, is seeping once more into the living flesh of Arda. He tries to speak of it. He journeys to the borders of Lothlorien, seeking audience with the Lady Galadriel. He travels to Rivendell, standing before the wise and measured gaze of Elrond half-elven. He even dares to approach the White Council, carrying with him the evidence of his fears. Withered branches, the feathers of birds that died without cause, soil that rejects the touch of seed and root. He speaks with urgency, with the authority of one who knows the language of beast and bow better than any tongue of men or elves. But they do not hear him. Oh, they listen. Galadriel's eyes soften with concern. Elrond offers counsel and patience. Gandalf the Grey nods gravely, for he alone among the Astari senses the shadow of truth in Radagast's words. But Saruman the White, the leader of their order, the most learned of the wise, dismisses him with barely concealed contempt. "The brown wizard sees doom in every dying leaf," he says, his voice smooth as polished stone. "He has spent too long among the beasts. He has forgotten the greater concerns of our time." And so the warning goes unheeded. Radagast returns to Rhosgobel alone, his heart heavy with the knowledge that no one understands what is coming. They see Sauron. They see the necromancer in his fortress of shadow. They see the gathering armies, the forging of rings, the slow encroachment of darkness across the map of Middle-earth. But they do not see what Radagast sees. They do not feel the tremor in the deep places, the ancient malice stirring beneath the surface of the world like a sleeper turning in restless dreams. Night falls over Rhosgobel, and with it comes the storm. Lightning splits the sky, but the thunder that follows is wrong. Too low, too slow. It rumbles not from the clouds, but from the earth itself, a deep groan that seems to echo from the bones of the world. Radagast stands in the doorway of his home, rain streaming down his weathered face, and he turns his gaze eastward, toward Mirkwood, toward Dol Guldur, toward the lands beyond the forest where the maps grow vague and the memories of the elves fade into silence. And then he hears it, a cry. Distant, inhuman, neither beast nor spirit, but something in between. A sound of such ancient anguish that it freezes the blood. It rises from the dark places of the world, from caverns that have not seen light since the First Age, from roots that burrow deeper than any dwarf has delved. It is not a cry of awakening. It is a cry of recognition, of resumption, of something that has been waiting, patient, and implacable for the turning of the ages. Radagast's fingers tighten on his staff. His voice, when he speaks, is barely a whisper, swallowed by the storm. It begins again. And in the darkness of Mirkwood, in the poisoned soil of the Brown Lands, in the deep places beneath Dol Guldur where even the bravest dare not tread, something ancient and terrible stirs. Not Sauron, not a servant of the Dark Lord, but something older, something that was woven into the very fabric of the world in the days of its marring, something that Radagast alone has sensed, and that no one else will believe until it is far, far too late. The brown wizard stands alone against the storm, guardian of secrets no one wants to hear, bearer of warnings no one will heed. And the darkness, patient and inevitable, begins its slow, inexorable return. To understand what Radagast knew, we must first understand what Radagast was. The tales paint him as the least of the Astari, the wizard who preferred the company of birds to the councils of kings, who wandered the wild places with twigs in his hair and moss on his staff. The hobbits of the Shire might have called him peculiar. The men of Rohan might have named him quaint. Even among his own order, he was considered eccentric, perhaps even foolish, a Maya who had forgotten his purpose, lost in the simple joys of hedgerow and hollow. But this is a grave misunderstanding. Radagast was not diminished by his love of the natural world. He was empowered by it. For he alone among the Astari was chosen by Yavanna herself, the Vala who nurtured all growing things, who sang the first seeds into being, who wept when Morgoth marred the spring of Arda. Radagast came to Middle-earth not as a counselor to kings or a warrior against shadow, but as a guardian of the living world, the voice of root and wing in an age when such voices were growing faint. And it is precisely this attunement that allowed him to perceive what others could not. The sources are fragmentary, scattered like leaves across the vast forest of Tolkien's writings. In the unfinished tales, we find brief mention of Radagast's mission, his allegiance to Yavanna, his dwelling in Roscoble at the edge of Mirkwood. In the essay on the Astari, we learn that he was counted among the Maiar of Alle, though Yavanna claimed him for her own purposes. In the margins of drafts and the footnotes of letters, we catch glimpses of a wizard whose power was not diminished, but simply different, a power that operated not through fire and lightning, but through the slow, patient language of the living earth. The Red Book of Westmark offers little. Radagast appears only briefly in the tales preserved by the hobbits, a messenger bearing news of the Nine, a distant figure on the periphery of greater events. But the woodmen of Mirkwood remember him differently. In their songs, he is Radagast the Tender, Radagast the Listener, the brown wizard who walked among the trees and heard their grief. To them, he was not a fool but a healer, a guardian who stood between their villages and the creeping darkness when no one else would come. And it is in the oral traditions of these woodmen that we find the first clues. They speak of a time, decades before the War of the Ring, when Radagast began to change. He grew quieter, more withdrawn. He would stand for hours at the edge of the forest, staring eastward toward the brown lands, that blasted waste where nothing grew. He would emerge from the deep woods with soil-stained hands and eyes haunted by visions he would not name. The animals that gathered around him grew restless, agitated, as though they sensed through him something that mortal senses could not perceive. The brown lands. That cursed expanse of lifeless earth east of the Anduin, south of Mirkwood, where once the gardens of the Entwives bloomed in beauty beyond measure. The Ents remember it as a wound that will not heal, a sorrow that has no consolation. But Radagast came to believe something more disturbing. He believed the Brown Lands were not merely destroyed by Sauron's malice in the wars of the Second Age. He believed they were marked by something older, something that predated even the Dark Lord's return. Tolkien left this mystery unresolved. In his letters, he pondered the fate of the Entwives, suggested they might have fled east, might have been destroyed in the last alliance, might linger in diminished form beyond the maps. But he also hinted at ecological mysteries deeper than war, at corruptions woven into the substance of Middle-earth itself, legacies of the first enemy that could not be undone by any victory of arms. Radagast, with his singular connection to the natural world, felt these corruptions like thorns in his own flesh. He traveled to the Brown Lands more than once, walking alone across that desolate expanse under a pitiless sky. What he found there is not recorded in any chronicle. But the woodmen say that when he returned, he carried with him a single seed, blackened and twisted, that he showed to no one but buried in a secret place. They say he wept over it, mourning not just for what had been lost, but for what had been changed, transformed at a level so fundamental that even the power of the Valor could not restore it. There are other fragments. A mention in Elvish records of Radagast seeking access to the archives of Rivendell, requesting texts from the First Age, accounts of the wars against Morgoth, descriptions of the marring of Arda. A note in the records of Lothlorien that he came before Galadriel with questions about the nature of the earth itself. about whether the substance of the world could be permanently poisoned, permanently corrupted. And there is one line, preserved in a forgotten woodman chronicle, copied by a scribe who likely did not understand its significance. In the year when the shadow first fell upon Greenwood, the brown wizard spoke of a shape seen wandering the waste, a shadow that left no footprints, that cast no reflection in water, that moved as though the land itself were dreaming of something it wished to forget. A shape without footprints, a shadow that the earth itself remembered. What did Radagast see in the brown lands? What knowledge did he glean from the dying trees of Mirkwood, from the frightened animals, from the whispers of the soil? The texts do not say, but they suggest, in their silences and their fragments, that Radagast the Brown discovered something the wise were not prepared to hear. Something older than Sauron, something that had never truly died. Long before the fortress of Dol Guldur cast its shadow across the maps of Middle-earth, Greenwood the Great began to die. Not suddenly, not with fire and battle and the clear signs of war. The forest darkened slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a wound that festers beneath the skin. A tree here would wither without cause. A grove there would fall silent, its birds vanished, its streams grown stagnant. The sylvan elves who dwelt in the northern reaches noticed it first. A creeping unease, a sense that the forest was forgetting its own song. But they could not name the source of their disquiet, and so they withdrew deeper into their remaining strongholds, lighting their lanterns against a darkness that seemed to rise not from without, but from within. Radagast sensed it decades before the wise took notice. He walked through Greenwood in those days as a traveler walks through the corridors of a dying friend's house, with reverence, with sorrow, with the terrible awareness that something beloved is slipping away. His bare feet pressed against soil that once thrummed with life, and now it felt muted, distant, as though a veil had fallen between the surface of the earth and the deep roots where the oldest magic dwelt. The trees still stood, their trunks broad and ancient, but they no longer spoke with the clarity they once had. Their voices were confused, fragmented, as though they were dreaming troubled dreams from which they could not wake. He placed his hands against their bark and listened, and what he heard made his heart grow cold. The trees spoke of a poison, not the crude toxins of war, not the burning and hewing of axes, but something more insidious. A corruption that moved through the roots like a slow tide, seeping from somewhere deep below, somewhere the trees could not see but only feel. It was as though the earth itself were sick, as though the very substance of the world were turning sour, rejecting the life it had once nurtured. The corruption did not announce itself. It did not rage or roar. It simply unmade things, quietly, patiently, with the inevitability of rot. Radagast began to map the sickness. He traveled from grove to grove, marking the places where the darkness was strongest. He found patterns that should not exist. The corruption did not spread outward from Dol Guldur as one might expect if it were merely the influence of the necromancer. Instead, it seemed to well up from certain focal points scattered throughout the forest, places that had no obvious connection to Sauron's fortress. Old places. Places where the land dipped into hollows, and the trees grew twisted even in the days of their youth. Places that, when Radagast consulted the fragmented lore of the elder days, had names in the old tongues, names that meant cursed ground, shadow hollow, wound place. He found a clearing where no birds would land. He found a stream that ran clear as crystal, but in which no fish swam and from which no animal would drink. He found a ring of ancient oaks, their trunks blackened from the inside out, their roots gnarled into shapes that resembled clawing hands. When he knelt and pressed his ear to the ground, he heard something that should not be possible. A rhythm, a pulse, slow, deep, patient, as though something beneath the earth were breathing. The animals knew the danger before any other living thing. Deer began to flee the forest in unprecedented numbers, streaming southward and westward in herds so large that the men of Rohan spoke of it as a marvel and an omen. Wolves, those ancient enemies of the free peoples, abandoned their hunting grounds and traveled by daylight, their eyes wide and wild, their howls edged with a terror that transcended hunger. Foxes left their dens, squirrels abandoned their hordes, even the insects. The beetles and ants and spiders moved in great migrations, fleeing toward the west as though driven by an instinct older than thought. Radagast walked among them, speaking in the languages of fur and feather, asking them what they had seen. And they told him, in the fragmented, image-soaked way that animals communicate, of shapes that moved in the deep forest, shapes that had no bodies, shadows that fell across the ground but were cast by nothing. A presence that crushed the will to live simply by existing, that drained the warmth from the air and the hope from the heart. One night, beneath a sky choked with clouds, Radagast performed a ritual granted to him by Yavanna herself, a communion that allowed him to see through the eyes of the forest, to perceive the world as the trees perceived it, through root and sap and the slow turning of seasons. What he saw in that vision broke something in him. He saw the forest as it truly was. Not a collection of individual trees, but a single vast organism, its roots interwoven beneath the soil in a network of staggering complexity. And he saw that network dying, threads of connection severing, roots shriveling. The great underground weave that had sustained Greenwood for millennia was unraveling, strand by strand, as though something were eating it from below. And at certain nodes in that network, at the places where the oldest and deepest roots converged, he saw darkness. Not the absence of light, but the presence of something that negated light, that unmade it. Pockets of unbeing, of anti-life, that pulsed with a rhythm that matched the slow breathing he had heard in the cursed clearing. When Radagast woke from the vision, he was weeping. He understood then what the wise did not. The necromancer in Dal Guldur was not the source of the forest's corruption. He was drawn to it. The fortress had not been chosen at random. It sat atop one of those nodes, one of those ancient wound places, and Sauron had settled there because the darkness called to him, because it resonated with his own malice, because it offered him a foundation of corruption upon which to build his power. But that foundation was not his creation. It was far, far older. Radagast gathered his evidence. He collected leaves that withered though their branches were healthy. He brought forth birds born blind, their eyes clouded with a milky film that no healer could cure. He carried soil samples from the cursed places, soil that felt cold to the touch even in summer, that rejected every seed he planted in it. He prepared testimonies from the woodmen, accounts of strange lights seen beneath the earth, of sounds like grinding stone echoing from caves no one had dared to enter. And he brought all of this to the wise, hoping, praying that they would understand. But as he walked the long road to Rivendell, as he rehearsed in his mind the words he would use to convey the magnitude of what he had discovered, a terrible doubt gnawed at him. Because the truth he had uncovered was too vast, too ancient, too interwoven with the very fabric of the world. To accept what Radagast knew would mean accepting that Middle-earth itself was wounded at a level beyond healing, that the victory over Morgoth in the First Age had not been complete, that the Dark Lord's malice had soaked so deeply into the substance of Arda that it could never be fully removed. Who would want to believe such a thing? Who would dare? There are horrors in Tolkien's world that transcend the deeds of any single Dark Lord. Sauron was mighty. Sauron was terrible. But Sauron was made, a servant who became a tyrant, a Maya who fell into shadow through pride and the corruption of his master. Morgoth, the first and greatest of the enemies of the world, was something else entirely. Morgoth was a Vala, a power who walked with the Aenir in the timeless halls, who sang in the music that shaped creation itself. And when he fell, when his jealousy and his hunger curdled into hatred, he did not merely oppose the work of the other Valar. He sought to unmake it, to pour his own essence into the fabric of reality and bend it toward his will. This was the marring of Arda. It is a concept that echoes through every corner of Tolkien's mythology, a wound that cannot be healed until the world is broken and remade. Morgoth, in his arrogance and his malice, expended his own power, the native strength of his being, to corrupt the matter of Arda itself. He wove his will into stone and water, into wind and fire, into the very substance from which all living things are made. He did this so completely, so fundamentally, that even after his defeat and expulsion into the void, his influence remained, embedded in the world like poison in the blood. The earth remembers. That is the terrible truth that Radagast uncovered. The earth itself carries the echo of Morgoth's malice, and in certain places, under certain conditions, that echo can awaken. It does not need a Dark Lord to command it. It does not require servants or armies. It simply is a lingering spite, a residual hunger, a shadow woven so deeply into the world that it has become part of the world's nature. Radagast felt this poison through his connection to the living world. To him, attuned as he was to the slow voice of root and stone, it was like standing beside a river and tasting bitter ash on the tongue, like pressing a hand to a tree and feeling beneath the bark a feverish heat that should not exist. The animals that fled Mirkwood were not fleeing Sauron. They were fleeing something older, something that preceded Sauron, something that had called to the Dark Lord across the centuries and drawn him to Dol Guldur because his own darkness recognized a kindred presence. There are places in Middle-earth where Morgoth's touch remains strongest. The withered heath, where dragons breed in the distant north. Angban's ruins in the Iron Mountains, from which no life has returned. The pits beneath Thangorodrim, sealed and silent, but not empty. And scattered throughout the lands, in places whose names have been forgotten or never spoken, there are fissures, points where the marring runs deepest, where the substance of the world is weakest, where the ancient poison lies close to the surface. Radagast came to believe that Dol Guldur sat atop one such fissure. He found evidence in the behavior of the land itself. Trees grew deformed near the fortress, their trunks spiraling in patterns that defied nature. The soil, when examined, contained crystals of a substance unknown to any lore. Black, glassy, cold to the touch, that crumbled to dust when exposed to sunlight. Animals that strayed too close to the hill did not merely die. They changed, their bodies twisting, their minds fracturing, as though something in the air or the ground were rewriting the pattern of their being. And then there were the dreams. The woodmen spoke of them in whispers. Nightmares that swept through entire villages, dreams of vast darkness pressing down from above and below, of being buried alive in cold earth, of voices speaking in languages that predated speech. Radagast himself suffered these dreams, waking in the dead of night with his heart pounding, and his mind filled with images he could not name. Great shapes moving through the void, the echo of hammers beating in lightless forges, the scream of the world itself as it was bent and twisted into forms it was never meant to take. He realized with dawning horror that these were not merely dreams. They were memories. Memories held by the land itself, rising to the surface like corpses from a thawing lake. The earth around Dal Guldur remembered the First Age. It remembered the wars of Morgoth, and in its slow, patient way, it was trying to warn the living that the past was not as dead as they believed. Radagast brought this knowledge to the White Council. He spoke of the marring. He spoke of Morgoth's residual influence. He spoke of the fissures and the poison and the terrible possibility that Sauron was not the ultimate enemy, but merely the latest manifestation of a corruption that ran deeper than any of them had imagined. He urged the wise to consider that their focus on the necromancer, while necessary, might be blinding them to a more fundamental threat, a threat woven into the very bones of the world. And Saruman, chief of the Astari, most learned in the lore of the enemy, dismissed him with a contempt that bordered on cruelty. "You speak of ancient history as though it were present danger," Saruman said, his white robes gleaming in the lamplight of the council chamber. "Morgoth is cast out. His power is broken. What remains is Sauron, and Sauron alone. Your fears, Radagast, are the fears of one who spends too much time among witless creatures, and not enough among those who understand the true shape of the world." Galadriel said nothing, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. Elrond listened with the patience of the ages, but he too offered no support. Even Gandalf, who respected Radagast more than any of the others, could not bring himself to fully credit the Brown Wizard's warnings. The idea was too vast, too terrible. To accept it would mean accepting that their struggle was not against a defeatable enemy, but against the world itself, against a wound that could not be healed, a poison that could not be purged. Radagast left the council in silence. And as he walked alone through the twilight forests, a single question haunted him, echoing in his mind like the slow pulse he had heard beneath the cursed clearings. If the wise will not listen, who will stand against what is waking? The White Council convened in Rivendell under a sky heavy with autumn rain. It was not the first time the wise had gathered to discuss the growing shadow, nor would it be the last. But for Radagast, standing before them in the soft lamplight of Elrond's hall, it felt like a trial. Not of the enemy, but of himself. He had come prepared with evidence, with testimonies, with fragments of living and dying things that spoke more eloquently than any words. But as he stood there, rain-soaked and travel-worn, with twigs still tangled in his beard and mud on his cloak, he felt the weight of their gazes, measuring, assessing, judging. Saruman sat at the head of the gathering, resplendent in robes of shimmering white, his staff polished to a mirror shine. His face was composed, serene, but his eyes held a glint of impatience. To his right sat Galadriel, the Lady of Light, her beauty undimmed by the ages, her presence like a song half-heard. Elrond presided as host, his expression thoughtful and grave. Gandalf the Grey sat somewhat apart, his weathered face creased with concern, his pipe unlit. And there were others, Círdan the Shipwright, ancient beyond measure, Glorfindel, who had walked in the light of the two trees, elven lords whose names were remembered in songs from the First Age. Radagast stood before them and felt small. But he began to speak. He spoke of the animals fleeing westward in numbers unseen in living memory. He spoke of trees dying from within, their roots poisoned by something that crept through the soil like a slow tide. He spoke of the cursed places in Mirkwood, the nodes of corruption where even the bravest dared not go. He described the rhythm he had heard beneath the earth, the pulse of something ancient and malign. He unrolled maps he had drawn himself, marking in brown ink the places where the darkness was strongest, and he showed how those places did not align with Dal Guldur alone, but formed a pattern, a constellation of wounds across the land. He brought forth his evidence. A branch from an oak in Mirkwood, its bark blackened as though by fire, but cold to the touch. Feathers from a bird found dead with no mark upon it, its eyes clouded with a film that no disease could account for. A vial of soil from the Brown lands, soil so lifeless that it crumbled to dust at a touch, soil in which not even mold would grow. He placed these before the council like offerings at an altar, his hands trembling slightly, his voice low but urgent. "This is not the work of Sauron alone," he said. "What I have found suggests a corruption far older, woven into the very substance of Middle-earth. The necromancer sits in Dal Guldur, yes, but he sits there because the darkness beneath called to him." "I believe," he hesitated, searching for words that would not sound mad. "I believe we are seeing the reawakening of Morgoth's poison, the marring itself stirring in the deep places of the world." Silence fell across the chamber. It was not the silence of contemplation, but of disbelief. Radagast saw it in their faces, the polite skepticism of Elrond, the troubled frown of Gandalf, the blank incomprehension of the lesser lords. And in Saruman's eyes something colder, disdain. The white wizard rose slowly to his feet, his robes whispering like wind through bare branches. "Radagast," he began, his voice smooth and measured, the voice of a teacher addressing a slow pupil. "Your dedication to the living world is admirable. No one questions your love for bird and beast, for tree and stream. But you allow that love to cloud your judgment. You see patterns where there are none. You hear whispers where there is only the wind." Radagast opened his mouth to protest, but Saruman raised a hand, silencing him. "The necromancer is Sauron. Of this we are certain. He has returned to power in Dal Guldur, gathering his strength, forging alliances with the forces of darkness. This is the enemy we face. Not some phantom corruption from the elder days, not the ghost of Morgoth reaching from the void. The Dark Lord is cast out. His power is broken. What remains is his servant, and servants can be defeated." "But the land," Radagast began. "The land suffers because Sauron makes it suffer," Saruman interrupted, his tone hardening. "He poisons the forest with his sorcery. He taints the earth with his malice. When we move against him, when we cast him from his stronghold, the land will heal. This is the natural order of things. Life returns when shadow is lifted. Surely even you, with your rustic wisdom, can understand this." The words stung like a slap. Radagast looked to the others, searching for support. Galadriel met his gaze, and for a moment he thought he saw something there, a flicker of recognition, a shadow of doubt. She leaned forward slightly, her voice like silver bells in a distant valley. "Radagast speaks from a knowledge we do not possess," she said carefully. "His communion with the living world grants him insights hidden from our sight. Should we not, at least, consider that there may be truth in his concerns?" Saruman turned to her, and his expression, though still composed, held a note of reproach. "My lady, wisdom requires discernment. We cannot allow fear of ancient shadows to distract us from present dangers. Radagast is sincere, I do not doubt, but sincerity is not the same as truth. He sees the symptoms of Sauron's power, and mistakes them for something greater. Elrond spoke then, his voice carrying the weight of 3 ages. It is not impossible that the marring of Arda lingers in certain places. Morgoth's corruption was profound. But Radagast, you ask us to believe that this corruption is not merely residual, but active, that it moves with intention, that it calls to Sauron rather than being exploited by him. This is a grave claim. Do you have evidence beyond intuition? Radagast felt his certainty waver. How could he prove what he felt? How could he quantify the sickness in the soil, the terror in the eyes of fleeing animals, the pulse he had heard in the deep places? These were truths known to the heart, not the mind. They were truths that could not be laid out in council chambers and debated like treaties. I know what I have sensed, he said quietly. I know what the forest tells me, and I know that if we do not act, if we do not investigate the true nature of this corruption, we may defeat Sauron only to find that the darkness remains. Gandalf stirred, his gray eyes thoughtful. I do not dismiss Radagast's concerns entirely, he said, his voice gravelly and kind. There are mysteries in Middle-earth that none of us fully understand, but our resources are limited, our time is short. We must focus on the threat we can name and confront. Perhaps, when Sauron is dealt with, we can turn our attention to these deeper questions. It was a compromise, a gentle refusal. Radagast felt something break inside him. Not anger. He had no room for anger, only a deep, aching sorrow. He gathered his evidence, his blackened branches and dead birds, his vials of poisoned soil. No one moved to stop him. No one asked to examine the samples more closely. They had made their decision, and he was simply the eccentric brown wizard, the one who cared more for sparrows than strategy. As he turned to leave, he heard Saruman's voice, low but carrying, as though the white wizard intended him to hear. The brown wizard grows more unstable. His isolation has made him see phantoms. We must ensure he does not spread these fears among the people. Panic serves the enemy as surely as treachery. Radagast did not look back. He walked out into the rain, into the cold autumn night, and began the long journey back to Roscoble. And as he walked, he whispered a prayer to Yavanna, a plea that someone, somewhere, would understand before it was too late. But the rain swallowed his words, and the darkness pressed close, and he was alone. The animals know when the world is breaking. They do not understand it as the wise understand, through lore and memory and the cataloging of signs. They understand it in their bones, in the ancient instincts that predate thought, in the wordless language of survival that has guided their kind since the first dawn. And in the years before the War of the Ring, across the length and breadth of Middle-earth, the animals began to move. It started as a trickle. A family of foxes abandoning a den that had sheltered their bloodline for generations. A flock of ravens leaving their roost in Mirkwood and flying west, their cries echoing mournfully across the gray sky. Deer disappearing from their traditional grazing grounds, vanishing into the deeper woods or crossing rivers they had never crossed before. At first, the woodmen and the scattered folk of Rivanion took little notice. Animals wander. Such is their nature. But then the trickle became a flood. Wolves traveled in the daylight, their packs broken and scattered, their eyes wide with a fear that no hunter had ever seen in them. They did not hunt. They did not howl their territorial claims. They simply ran westward, always westward, as though fleeing an invisible fire. Entire herds of deer and elk moved in vast columns, trampling fields and crossing roads. their flight so urgent that they did not stop even when men tried to turn them back. Birds darkened the sky in flocks so dense they blotted out the sun, thousands upon thousands of them, fleeing the east as though winter had come early and without mercy. And it was not only the creatures of forest and field. Creatures of the deep woods came forth as well, lynxes and bears, creatures that avoided the haunts of men, now stumbling through villages in broad daylight, gaunt and exhausted. Even the insects joined the exodus. Spiders, those patient architects of shadow, abandoned their webs in Mirkwood and spread westward in a creeping tide. Ants marched in lines that stretched for miles. Bees swarmed without queens, disoriented, desperate. Radagast walked among them, speaking in their tongues, asking the question that burned in his mind. What did you see? The answers came in fragments, in images, in sensations that barely translated into words. A wolf, panting and exhausted, sent him a vision. Darkness spreading across the ground like ink in water, not falling from above but rising from below. A raven, perched on his staff, communicated a sound it had heard in the night, a grinding, like the turning of great wheels deep in the earth, or the scraping of stone on stone in lightless caverns. A deer, trembling as Radagast placed his hand gently on its flank, shared a feeling, the sensation of the ground watching, of being observed by something vast and patient and utterly devoid of mercy. But the most disturbing testimony came from a fox, half-starved, its fur matted with mud and burrs, that collapsed at the edge of Roscoble one cold evening. Radagast carried it inside, warmed it by the fire, fed it scraps of bread and honey. And as the creature's strength returned, it looked at him with eyes that held an intelligence beyond its kind, an intelligence born of terror. Radagast laid his hand upon the fox's head and entered its mind. What he found there nearly broke him. The fox had lived in a den near the southern borders of Mirkwood, not far from the eaves where the darkness was deepest. It had hunted the twilight paths, raised 3 litters of kits, lived a life governed by the simple rhythms of hunger and safety. But one night it had awakened to a sound. Not a sound heard with ears, but felt, a vibration that traveled through the earth, through the roots of trees, through the very bones of the world. The fox had emerged from its den and seen something. A shape. No, not a shape. An absence of shape. A place where the moonlight seemed to bend and fail, where the air itself grew thick and cold. It moved across the forest floor without disturbing a single leaf, without leaving a track, and yet the trees recoiled from it as it passed. And wherever it went, silence followed. Not the peaceful silence of night, but the silence of the grave, the silence of a place where life has been and is no more. The fox had fled. Its mate, slower to react, had not. The last image in the fox's memory was of its mate standing frozen at the den's entrance, watching the approaching absence, unable to move, unable even to whimper. And then nothing. The mate was simply gone, not killed, not devoured, erased, as though it had never been. Radagast withdrew his hand, shaking. He began to map the migrations, tracking the paths the animals took, marking the places they fled from with particular care. And a pattern emerged that confirmed his darkest fears. The animals were not fleeing randomly. They were fleeing from specific locations, the same nodes of corruption he had identified years before, the places where the ancient poison ran deepest. But now those places were active. Something had changed. Something had awakened or was awakening, and the creatures of the wild, with their uncorrupted instincts, sensed it as surely as prey senses the approach of a predator. Radagast took his findings to the edge of Lothlorien, hoping to gain an audience with Galadriel. But the Marchwardens turned him away with apologies. The lady was in council with her lord and could not be disturbed. He traveled to the northern borders of Mirkwood, seeking Thranduil's halls, but the Elven King was preparing for war and had no time for the concerns of a wandering wizard. Even the Beornings, those sturdy folk who lived closest to the wild and understood its ways, could offer him nothing but confirmation. Yes, they had seen the migrations. Yes, they had felt the unease. But what could they do? Lock their doors, tend their beehives, wait for the storm to pass? No one understood. The animal exodus was not a curiosity. It was a warning. A warning delivered in the most primal language of Middle-earth, the language of flight and fear, the language that said, something is coming. Something that even the children of Yavanna, who have no concept of evil or malice, recognize as wrong. And still the wise focused on Sauron. Still they spoke of the necromancer and his machinations, of rings and armies and the movements of men. They did not see that the animals, in their simplicity, understood a truth that the lore masters had forgotten, that the enemy is not always a person or a will, but sometimes a condition, a sickness, a wound in the world itself that spreads regardless of who commands it. Radagast stood one evening at the edge of a stream, watching a family of otters pass by, heading west. They did not stop to hunt. They did not play in the water as otters do. They simply swam, their movements efficient and joyless, driven by an imperative they could not name. He knelt at the water's edge and whispered, "I see you. I hear you. I will not forget." But even as he spoke, he felt the terrible weight of his isolation. He was one wizard, alone, trying to hold back a tide that no one else believed was coming. And the animals, bless them, could only flee. They could not fight. They could not stand against what was rising. They could only run and hope and die quietly when the darkness finally caught them. Somewhere to the east, deep in the ravaged heart of Mirkwood, a cry echoed through the night. A cry that was not animal, not spirit, but something between. The otters froze in the water, their sleek bodies trembling. Then they dove and swam faster, their small hearts pounding with a terror beyond words. Radagast watched them go. And in the language of the Aenir, a tongue not heard in Middle-earth for ages beyond count, he whispered a single word. Awakening. Radagast fought a war that no chronicle recorded. It was not a war of swords and banners, not a war that would be sung of in the halls of men or remembered in the archives of elves. It was a quiet war, waged in the deep places of Mirkwood, in glades where sunlight no longer fell, in glens where the streams ran black and silent. It was a war against an enemy that had no form, no voice, no strategy, only presence, only the slow, patient work of corruption spreading through the living world like rot through wood. He began by healing what he could. In the early years, when the darkness was still subtle, still creeping at the edges rather than spreading wholesale, Radagast walked from grove to grove, laying his hands on the sick trees, speaking words of power taught to him by Yavanna herself. Sometimes it worked. A tree that had been withering would shudder, its leaves turning from sickly yellow back to green, its roots drinking deep from the earth once more. A stream that had fallen silent would begin to sing again, its waters clearing as though a veil had been lifted. Birds would return to a grove, and the foxes would dig their dens, and for a time, a brief, precious time, life would reassert itself. But the victories were temporary. He would return to a grove he had healed months before and find it dying again. The corruption returned, seeping up from below like water from a poisoned well. The trees he had saved would be withered once more, their bark splitting, their roots blackened. The streams he had cleansed would run foul again, choked with a silt that smelled of ash and iron. It was as though the land itself were fighting against him, or rather, as though the land were no longer entirely itself, as though something else had woven its will into the soil and could not be easily removed. Radagast began to understand the scale of what he faced. This was not a curse that could be broken with a word of power. This was not a spell that could be countered with knowledge and will. This was corruption at the level of substance, woven into the matter of the world itself. To heal it completely would require power beyond what any single Maya could wield, perhaps beyond even the valor, unless they chose to unmake and remake the land entirely. And yet, he continued. He warded certain glades, inscribing runes of protection in the old tongues, calling upon the names of the valor to shelter the few places where the darkness had not yet taken root. He created sanctuaries, hidden refuges where the animals could gather and rest before continuing their flight westward. He spoke to the Ents, those ancient shepherds of the forest, and though they were slow to rouse and slower still to act, he sensed their deep unease, their growing awareness that the forest they had tended for so long was slipping beyond their ability to save. But mostly, he fought alone. He walked through the cursed places, the nodes of corruption where even the bravest of the woodmen feared to tread. He stood at the edge of clearings where the ground was black and lifeless, where the air shimmered with a heat that had no source, and he spoke words of defiance into the silence. He did not know if the corruption could hear him. He did not know if it understood language or thought or anything resembling will. But he spoke nonetheless, because to remain silent felt like surrender. "You will not have this forest," he said to the darkness. "You will not unmake what Yavanna has grown. I stand against you, though I stand alone." The darkness did not answer. But sometimes when he stood in those cursed places, he felt something press against his mind. Not a thought, not a voice, but a weight, a vast and terrible patience that seemed to say, "I have waited since the world was young. I can wait longer than your defiance." The isolation wore on him. He grew thinner, his hair more tangled, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. The birds that accompanied him grew quiet, sensing his despair. He stopped visiting the woodmen villages, stopped seeking news from the wider world, because every time he left the forest to bring his warnings to the wise, he returned to find that the corruption had spread further in his absence, claiming more glades, poisoning more streams. It was a cruel arithmetic. Every day spent away from Mirkwood was a day the darkness gained ground. He began to dream of failure. In his dreams, he walked through a forest that had become a graveyard, trees standing like tombstones, their branches bare, their roots turned to stone. He walked alone through that silent waste, and he knew with the certainty of dreams that he had failed, that the corruption had spread beyond stopping, that all of Middle-earth would eventually become like the Brown lands, lifeless and still, a monument to the malice of the first enemy. He woke from these dreams with a name on his lips, a name he had not spoken aloud in centuries, Morgoth. And he understood, finally, the true nature of his enemy. He was not fighting Sauron. He was fighting the shadow of Morgoth, the residue of the Dark Lord's original corruption, woven into the fabric of Arda so deeply that even the Valor's victory had not removed it. He was fighting something that could not be defeated, only contained, only held at bay through endless vigilance and sacrifice. It was a battle he could not win, but he fought anyway. because to do otherwise would be to abandon every bird, every beast, every blade of grass that trusted in the power of the valor to protect them. Because Yavanna had sent him to Middle-earth for this purpose, and he would not fail her, even if success was impossible. One evening, deep in the heart of Mirkwood, Radagast discovered an ancient elven ward, a stone carved with runes from the First Age, placed there by the Sindar in the days when they still believed the forest could be protected by such things. He knelt before it, tracing the worn symbols with his fingers, and he saw that the stone was cracked, not from age, not from weather. It had been broken from within, split by roots that glowed faintly in the twilight with a sickly greenish light, roots that should not exist, that belonged to no tree he knew, that pulsed with the slow rhythm he had heard so many times before. Radagast sat back on his heels, and for the first time in his long years in Middle-earth, he felt despair settle over him like a cloak. The wards were broken. The protections of the elder days were failing, and he was alone. The fall of Dol Guldur should have been a triumph. When the White Council finally moved against the necromancer, when Saruman and Galadriel and the gathered might of the wise drove Sauron from his stronghold, there was celebration among the free peoples. The shadow that had darkened southern Mirkwood for centuries was broken. The fortress stood empty, its dungeons open to the light, its towers silent. It was, by all accounts, a victory, but Radagast did not celebrate. He waited until the others had departed, until the elven warriors had withdrawn and the White Council had returned to their own realms to prepare for the greater struggles yet to come. And then, in the gray light of dawn, Radagast the Brown entered Dol Guldur alone. The fortress was a ruin. Not the picturesque ruin of ancient glories faded, but the ugly, brutal ruin of a place built for cruelty and suffering. The stones were black with soot and stained with substances Radagast did not want to identify. The air stank of decay and old fear. Chains hung from walls, their iron pitted and rusted. In the deeper chambers, he found cages barely large enough to hold a man, and bones, so many bones, scattered like kindling across the floors. But Radagast did not come to catalog Sauron's atrocities. He came to investigate what lay beneath. He descended through levels that even the White Council had not explored, following stairs that wound down into the roots of the hill. The stone grew older as he descended, older and colder, the architecture changing from the crude brutality of Sauron's, making to something more ancient, more deliberate. He found chambers whose walls were covered in runes he could not read, symbols that predated the script of the Eldar, that belonged to no language spoken in Middle-earth for 6,000 years. He found foundations that were not built but melted, stone that had been subjected to heat so intense it had flowed like water before cooling into twisted, blackened shapes. He found corridors that did not follow straight lines, but curved in patterns that hurt the eye, that seemed to fold back on themselves in ways that should not be possible. And he found silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that devoured sound, that made even his own breathing seem distant and muffled. At the deepest level, he found the cavern. It was vast, far larger than the hill above should have been able to contain. The ceiling was lost in darkness above. The floor was uneven, broken in places by fissures that exhaled cold air smelling of stone and time. And in the center of that cavern, sunk into the rock like a scar, was a pit. Radagast approached it slowly, his staff raised, light kindling at its tip. The light pushed back the darkness, revealing the pit's edges, smooth, almost glassy, as though the stone had been burned away by some immense heat. He leaned forward, peering into the depths, and the pit looked back, not with eyes, not with anything so tangible as a gaze. But Radagast felt it nonetheless, a presence, vast and alien, that stirred in the darkness below. It was not hostile. It was not even aware of him in any meaningful sense. It simply was existing in a state that had nothing to do with life or death as he understood them. It was a wound, a rupture, a place where the substance of the world had been torn and had never healed, where Morgoth's malice had burned so deeply into Arda that it had left a hollow, a void, a pocket of unbeing. Radagast staggered back, his heart pounding. He understood now. Dol Guldur had not been chosen by Sauron at random. The hill had called to him. The wound beneath it resonated with his own darkness, amplifying his power, grounding him in the ancient malice of his master. Sauron had not created the corruption of southern Mirkwood. He had merely activated it, drawing upon a reservoir of evil that had lain dormant since the First Age, waiting for a will strong enough to awaken it. And the wound was still there. Sauron's departure had changed nothing. Radagast explored the edges of the cavern, searching for answers, for some sign of how deep the corruption ran. He found roots, the roots of the trees above, descending through cracks in the stone, seeking water and nourishment. But where the roots neared the pit, they changed. They blackened. They twisted into shapes that resembled clawing hands or screaming faces or nothing recognizable at all. They grew brittle and glassy, as though transformed into some substance that was neither wood nor stone, but a corruption of both. He found water, too, a stream that trickled down one wall and pooled near the pit's edge. When he touched the water, it was cold beyond any natural cold, cold that burned his fingers and left them numb. He tried to speak a word of blessing over it, to cleanse it as he had cleansed so many streams in Mirkwood. But the word died on his lips, swallowed by the silence, and the water remained as it was, poisoned, irredeemable. He found inscriptions, too, fragments of text carved into the walls in scripts he half recognized, scripts used by the servants of Morgoth in the ancient days. He could not read them in full, but certain words stood out, repeated over and over. Melkor, Ardamard, the long winter, the sundering, the unmaking. This place had been known once. It had been marked, perhaps even guarded by those who understood its danger. But the guardians were long gone, and the knowledge had faded, and the wound had remained, patient and eternal, waiting. Radagast knelt at the edge of the pit, his hands pressed against the cold stone, and he wept. Not for himself, not even for the forest above, though he grieved for it. He wept for the world itself, for Ardamard, for the beautiful, broken creation that carried within it the scars of the first Dark Lord's hatred. He wept because he understood now that no victory over Sauron would ever be complete. The wound was too deep, the poison too old. Even if every servant of the enemy were cast down, even if the ring were destroyed and Sauron unmade, the world itself would still carry the memory of its breaking. As he knelt there, the pit pulsed. It was the same rhythm he had felt in the cursed clearings, in the dying trees, in the blackened soil. A slow, patient breathing, as though the earth itself were alive, or as though something lived in the earth, something vast and formless and utterly inimical to life. Radagast rose unsteadily to his feet. He could not stay here. The weight of the presence was too great, pressing against his mind like a physical force. He turned and climbed the long stairs back to the surface, back to the ruined halls of Dol Guldur, back to the open air and the gray sky. but he carried with him the knowledge of what lay beneath. And he knew with a certainty that chilled him more deeply than the pit's cold water that the darkness had not ended. It had merely paused, waiting. The War of the Ring ended in victory. The armies of Mordor were broken. The Dark Tower fell. The ring was unmade in the fires of Mount Doom, and with it, the power of Sauron was dissolved forever. Across Middle-earth, the free peoples celebrated. Men and elves and dwarves gathered in fellowship, toasting the courage of the ring-bearers, singing songs of triumph over darkness. The age of the enemy was over. A new age, the age of men, was beginning. Radagast did not attend the celebrations. He returned to Roscoble in the quiet days after the war, walking alone through the eaves of Mirkwood, Greenwood once more, as the elves now called it, for the shadow had lifted and the trees were beginning to heal. Sunlight fell through the canopy in golden shafts. Birds sang with a joy that had been absent for centuries. The deer returned, grazing fearlessly in glades where they had once fled in terror. It was as though the forest were waking from a long, troubled dream. But Radagast saw deeper than the surface. He walked among the trees and felt the change, yes, but he also felt what had not changed. The nodes of corruption were still there, buried beneath the healing surface, dormant but not destroyed. The poison in the roots was thinner, weakened by Sauron's fall, but it had not vanished. It could not vanish. It was woven too deeply into the fabric of the world, a legacy of the marring that no victory of arms could erase. Radagast stood in a glade where he had fought his lonely war for decades, a place he had tried and failed to heal countless times. Now, in the aftermath of Sauron's fall, the trees were growing again. Saplings pushed up through the soil. Flowers bloomed. But when he knelt and pressed his hand to the earth, he felt it still. The faint, distant pulse, the slow rhythm of something that slept but did not die. He sat there for a long time, listening. And then he rose, returned to Roscoble, and began to write. It was not a chronicle. It was not a history or a testimony meant for the archives of elves. It was a warning, written in the flowing script of the Eldar, but addressed to no one in particular, or perhaps to everyone, to the future, to whoever might one day read it and understand. He wrote of the marring of Arda. He wrote of Morgoth's corruption, of how the first Dark Lord had poured his malice into the substance of the world so completely that it could never be fully removed. He wrote of the wound beneath Dol Guldur, of the nodes of corruption scattered across Middle-earth, of the ancient poison that lay dormant in certain places, waiting for the right conditions to reawaken. He wrote of the animals' great migration, of the patterns he had mapped, of the visions granted to him by his communion with the natural world. He wrote of the council that would not listen, of the wise who dismissed his warnings, of the lonely war he had fought in the shadows while the great events of the age unfolded elsewhere. And then he wrote his prophecy. It was not a prophecy of doom, exactly. Radagast was not a seer in the manner of the elves, not gifted with foresight that pierced the veils of time. But he had walked Middle-earth for millennia, had listened to the slow voice of the land, had learned to sense the patterns hidden beneath the surface of events. And what he sensed now, in the quiet aftermath of victory, was this. Sauron's fall had healed the symptoms, but not the disease. The wound remained. The marring remained. And though it might sleep for centuries, for ages, it would not sleep forever. The world itself was broken at a fundamental level, and until that breaking was mended, until Arda itself was remade in the healing that the myths spoke of, the healing that would come only at the end of days, the potential for corruption would remain. He wrote of the signs to watch for: the sudden, unexplained sickening of forests, the mass migration of animals, the dreams of darkness rising from below, the discovery of places where the earth rejected life, where nothing grew and nothing could be healed. He wrote that these signs would not necessarily herald the return of a dark lord, not in the way that Sauron or Morgoth had been dark lords. They would herald something more subtle, more insidious, a condition, a sickness in the world itself that could exist without a mind to direct it, without a will to command it. The free peoples have fought against servants of the enemy, he wrote. They have learned to recognize the signs of dominion and tyranny, but they have not learned to recognize the signs of the marring itself. They do not understand that the world can rebel against life, not because it is commanded to, but because it has been wounded so deeply that rebellion is woven into its nature. He wrote that vigilance would be required, not the vigilance of armies and watchtowers, but the vigilance of those who tend the land, who listen to the voices of beast and plant, who remember that Middle-earth is not merely a stage upon which the great dramas of men and elves are played, but a living entity in its own right, scarred, suffering, in need of care that goes deeper than any sword can reach. He wrote that the wizards were leaving. Gandalf would sail west. Saruman was fallen. Radagast himself was weary beyond measure, and he did not know how much longer he could remain in Middle-earth. The elves, too, were departing, taking with them their knowledge and their memory. The age of men was beginning, and men, for all their courage and their strength, did not always understand the deeper magics, the older truths. Who will listen to the trees when the elves are gone? He wrote, who will hear the warnings of the beasts when the wizards have departed? Who will stand guard over the wounded places of the earth when those who remember the elder days have passed into the west? He did not answer his own questions. He could not. He finished the writing as the sun set over Mirkwood, Greenwood, and the sky turned the color of old gold. He sealed the pages in a leather case and placed it in a hollow of the great oak that grew beside his dwelling, the tree that had sheltered him for centuries, the tree that knew his voice better than any living thing. "Keep this," he whispered to the oak, "and if any come seeking wisdom, if any come with the humility to ask the forest for its knowledge, give it to them." The tree's roots stirred in the soil, a gesture of acknowledgement. Radagast stood there for a long time, his hand resting on the bark, drawing comfort from the slow, steady life of the tree. And then he turned away. In the days that followed, he prepared for departure. Not to the undying lands. He had no desire to sail west, to return to the light of Valinor and face the judgment or the pity of the Valar. His path lay elsewhere. East, some said, though no one knew for certain. Into the wild lands beyond the maps, where the forest still grew thick and the animals still ran free, where perhaps his knowledge and his care would still be needed. The birds of Rosgobel gathered around him in those final days, sensing his intention. They sang songs of farewell, and Radagast sang with them, his voice rough and unpracticed but filled with love. He walked one last time through the glades he had protected, speaking words of blessing and encouragement to the trees, urging them to remember, to hold fast, to resist the creeping darkness should it ever return. And on a morning when the mist lay thick upon the forest, when the world seemed poised between sleeping and waking, Radagast the Brown departed. He took no company. He carried only his staff, his worn cloak, and the knowledge that he had done what he could, that he had fought the good fight even though no one had understood, even though his warnings had gone unheeded. The woodmen say he was seen once more, years later, at the edge of the greenwood, standing beneath the eaves and watching the sun rise. They say he smiled, as though he had seen something that gave him hope. And then he turned and walked eastward, following the paths of the birds, and was never seen again in the lands west of the misty mountains. His prophecy remained, sealed in the hollow of the oak, waiting, like the wound beneath Dal Guldur, like the poison in the roots, like all the truths that the world is not ready to hear. Waiting for the day when someone, perhaps in an age yet to come, would have the wisdom to listen. There are truths in Tolkien's world that go unspoken, not because they are secret, but because they are too vast, too ancient, too interwoven with the fabric of existence to be easily grasped. Radagast the Brown touched one such truth, and it marked him forever. He saw that the battle for Middle-earth was never only against the servants of darkness, but against darkness itself, not as a force wielded by a will, but as a condition woven into the world, a legacy of the first great breaking that could not be undone by any single victory. The tale of Radagast is a tragedy, not because he failed, but because he succeeded in seeing what others refused to acknowledge. He carried a burden of knowledge that isolated him, that made him seem strange and foolish to those who measured wisdom by the standards of council chambers and battlefields. But he was neither strange nor foolish. He was simply attuned to a truth that operated on a different scale, the scale of the earth itself, the slow time of roots and stones, the long memory of a world that cannot forget its wounding. His warnings went unheeded. His war went unrecorded. His prophecy remains, hidden in a hollow tree, waiting for a reader who may never come. But perhaps that is the deeper lesson. Perhaps the point is not that Radagast's warnings should have been heeded, though they should have. Perhaps the point is that some truths must be borne alone, by those willing to stand vigil over the mysteries that the world cannot yet face. Perhaps there will always be watchers like Radagast, guardians of the forgotten places, speakers for the voiceless, those who understand that the greatest dangers are not always the ones that announce themselves with fire and iron, but the ones that creep silently through the roots, whispering of sorrows too old to name. Middle-earth endured. The free peoples triumphed. But the wound remains, and the marring endures, and somewhere in the deep places of the world, the slow pulse continues, patient and inevitable, waiting for the turning of ages that will bring either final healing or final darkness. And if you walk in the wild places, if you listen to the wind in the trees and the cry of birds fleeing across the sky, if you press your hand to the earth and feel, beneath the surface, warmth, a coldness that should not be there, then perhaps you will understand what Radagast knew, that the world is broken, that love alone is not enough to heal it, but that love, nonetheless, is all we have. The brown wizard walks now in lands beyond our knowing, following paths that no map records. His staff is weathered. His robes are threadbare. His companions are the birds and the beasts who recognize him still as kin. And in his wake, the trees whisper his name, Radagast, the one who listened, the one who knew. Dear listener, this story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.